we're not working with someone to do like a factorial analysis. We're doing it on our own.
Yes, yes, on your own. Yeah.
And you only
yeah.
want it about 15 minutes long, or how long?
Yeah, just about 15 minutes. You should be able to get in and be pretty concise. This is my hypothesis. This is what I'm testing. Walk through the statistics. You know, we'll get rid of all the fluff and just get to the meat of it.
Okay.
And then that's what I'll be looking for. I'm going to be looking for, do you understand what you're presenting? So pick something you understand, because you can pick whatever you want. Do you understand what you're presenting? And then I also want to see your presentation skills, because you guys, like your confidence and your ability to communicate, because that's also preparing you for dissertation defense that you're going to have to get up and present. It's going to prepare those of you who are in the classroom or who are going to be in the classroom, either as teaching assistants or once you get your PhD or whatever. So again, I kind of look from those holistic perspectives. I'm not a minute detail kind of person. I want the overall view, the overall holistic part to see, because we can always drill down and learn the minute details and get our skills in that. But do we have the overall concepts and the skills and the confidence in that? That's what I'm looking for.
Okay. Thank you.
I can tell you that I finished mine today and it's 13 minutes long.
Look at you go, Sarah.
Oh,
That's awesome.
This semester.
That's great. So, okay. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to go over some few things, kind of reviewing what we've done, and then a couple other things I want to hit on about overall statistics. Then I'm going to demonstrate an ANCOVA. I wanted to also bring in the MANOVA, the multivariate ANOVA. I'm going to record that separately and upload it because I just didn't have time to finish it out. I'm going to confess, I spent the weekend playing with my own data from my own research that I've been working on. And so I didn't pay as much detail to y'all's and get it finalized. Sorry. So, but tonight, that's what I want to do. Are there any other questions before we get started? All right, let's jump on in. So I'm going to share my screen and y'all keep me straight on this if I need to. And I'm going to okay, so I should be sharing my, can you see my PowerPoint? I have something here in the middle and I don't know what that is.
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay. So again, I'm going to go over ANCOVA. I sent y'all a data set that we'll do in SPSS. A spoiler alert, we're not going to get a significant finding because I couldn't find a data set that would give me one. So, but we'll go through that. And what I wanted to do is really talk about this from the perspective of what we have in our toolbox. And think of your statistics, your statistic test as your toolbox for analyzing your data and telling your story. And so we have our descriptive statistics. And again, remember, if it's nominal level data, we do counts. We have mean, median, mode, range, dispersion, and all of that for interval ratio level data, sometimes ordinal. We can look at relationships and we can look at prediction. We've talked about Pearson product correlation coefficient. We've talked about regression. We can talk about this thing on here. It's driving me crazy. We can talk about differences by using t-tests, whether it be independent samples, dependent samples. We've talked about the ANOVA, and there's different types of the ANOVA. There's subcategories or classifications, which are factorial, which is two-way ANOVA, the repeated measures ANOVA. We're going to look at ANCOVA tonight. We've got chi-square. So we have several things already in our toolbox, depending upon what we want to look at. And when we do our data, no matter what we do, we always want to do the cleaning of our data, right? We always want to take a look at it and make sure we don't have outliers, make sure everything's correctly entered, labeled correctly. And then we want to go through those assumptions. and make sure our data is going to meet whatever assumptions we need to meet for the statistical test we're using, okay? So we have the different levels of data: nominal, ordinal, interval ratio. I know I hit on this a lot, but again, it goes back to how that data is defined as to how you interpret it. If it's nominal, ordinal, interval ratio, how is it being measured? So it's important to really know that, because that's what you know. You have to know that to know what kind of test to run. So that's a real basic thing moving forward, to make sure you can always determine what level the variables are. If it's not your data, can you determine the level of variables? Or if it is your data, what level are you going to set them at when you start collecting them? Again, we have the descriptive statistics, which are the basics. We always do our descriptive statistics. Sometimes we can build it into the test we run by clicking a box that says the descriptive statistics. Sometimes we just do it separately to start with, just to get a sense of what our sample is, what those characteristics are. So we have those that we can actually work through. Then we have our inferential statistics, where we try to make some conclusions about some relationships, or we try to infer some things about the data. Beyond just describing, we try to make those statements. And when we use inferential statistics, again, we're talking about things like correlation, which is the Pearson product moment correlation primarily is what we've done. The t-test, the ANOVA, regression, chi-square, all of those things is where we start making some inferences about relationships between variables. We move beyond description, okay? When we have ordinal interval ratio level data, we can look at some correlation, independent samples t-test, dependent samples t-test, our regression. And I've just kind of broke these down for you again, so you'll just have a refresher. We have nominal, ordinal level variables. We have some chi-square, Wilcoxon. Nominal and ordinal level variables, when we fall into that, you'll notice ordinal level variables can be on both. So it depends on how you're using them. But we have, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, well, it'll come back to me. So nominal, ordinal level variables, we actually have different sets of statistics than we do for our interval ratio level variables, okay? So we have non-parametric statistics, typically when we're looking specifically at relationships at those variables that are at these levels, or if we have data that doesn't meet all the assumptions for the other tests, there's some equal tests in those non-parametric areas. And again, we always want our assumptions. We want to be cleaning our data before we do that. Each test has different assumptions that you have to meet. Once you hit multiple regression and then move forward with the more complex relationships like the covariates and all of that, you have more assumptions that you need to meet than if you're just looking at t-test or some one-way ANOVAs. The assumptions aren't quite as stringent, but you always want to make sure that you're meeting those assumptions. The perfect world has you checking your assumptions before you start running your statistical test. Now, SPSS, as we've learned, as you run your test, you can click all those boxes and it'll bring your assumptions also forward. So it makes it much easier to do. So you don't have to run assumptions and then start running your statistical test. In the perfect world, they tell you to run your assumptions first and clean that up to make, and then make sure that your data will meet your assumptions for your test. Because if you run it, when you run your test, we may tend to make our data fit what we need it to fit. So that's just kind of a, I guess that's the perfect world of statistics. You know, you do A, B, C, but we know for efficiency, it's just easier to build in those tests when we're running our ANOVA or when we're running our t-test or a multiple regression, so that we can look for our linearity or multicollinear all at the same time. So what you have to make sure of as a statistician, because all of you are becoming statisticians in terms of this. But what you have to make sure of is that you keep yourself honest, that you don't go back and make your data fit what you need it to fit. So there's changes that you can make in your data to meet those assumptions, but they have to be done according to statistical theory, statistical expectations, you know, and you need to be able to back up your actions again with evidence from the authors of the textbooks and things like that. So you always want to make sure your data is going to meet those. If you violate the assumptions, there are some assumptions you can violate and you can still run your test, but you have to explain those things in your results, because you don't want somebody assuming that you met the assumption. But if you have a reason to violate it and still run your test, again, support that with evidence from somebody who says it's okay to do that. The other thing I wanted to talk about tonight was fishing. And I don't know how many of y'all are fishermen, or if you, my father-in-law was a striper guide on the lake before he passed away. So I come from fishing, but I'm going to talk about fishing with statistics. And I thought about this because Sarah had emailed me on that last question on homework number 3. I was having you, and I decided I didn't word the question very well. And that's why I said, you know, do what you want to do with it. And I'm not going to count it, but I want to see what you did with it. Because, you know, her question to me was, do you want independent samples t-test among all these? That's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot for errors and things like that. That's where we get into this concept of fishing. So when you create your study, you create your research study, you have a focus, you have a hypothesis, or you have a research question. It's very much directed, okay? You know what variables you're going to be looking at to answer that research question. But oftentimes we will design our study and we'll collect additional variables because you know what? They may have an impact. So we need to know information just beyond our hypothesis, just beyond our research question. We need to know a few more things. And so we have extra data, or we can look at extra relationships. But what happens is if we go in and we conduct too many tests, just searching for those relationships, kind of just, you know, what about this one? What about this one? What about this one? It's a fishing expedition. So if you kind of veer away from what your hypothesis, what your research focus is, and you start looking at a whole bunch of different things, then this is called fishing, okay? Now, I'm going to tell you, honestly, I'm a fisherman when it comes to data, because I just love to go in and look at different relationships, but I stay true to my study on that. The problems with illicit fishing is that you can create a series of comparisons, and similar to what Sarah brought up, like if I have you look at independent samples t-test between the girls and the boys related to their pre-test, their post-test, and all of that. If we're doing multiple comparisons like that, I'm going to be at an increase for a type 1 error, okay, in at least one of those comparisons. So you do want to choose some tests that can be more efficient in that. But again, that may actually have meaning. It may be worth the risk because those relationships may have some meaning to my study, okay? In a worst case scenario, those who fish, they just simply probe for those associations and possible variables that are going to have a significant finding without the theory or critical thinking to back that up. Okay, so sometimes people will take their data and then they'll just go in there and start looking for different relationships with really no guidance for that. Okay, that's illicit fishing. You don't want to do that. Sooner or later, if you run enough, you're probably going to come up with something that has a statistically significant association. And oftentimes we're trained to say that's what we want. We want to show that statistical significance, right? That's the golden crown that we're trying to get. But really it's not, because even when we don't have statistically significant relationships, it tells us a lot. But sometimes if you keep running and if you keep adjusting your data, playing with your data and fishing through it, you're going to come up with something that's going to be statistically significant. And that's what people are looking for when they do this. So then oftentimes researchers, then they'll only report those statistically significant relationships and they'll ignore the ones that are not. That's the downfalls of fishing, or that's the downfalls of not keeping a clear focus on what you're looking at in your data for that particular study. Okay. Once you do your study, once you've got your data, you've got your results, you've kept focused on your hypothesis, you've kept focused on your research question. Once you have all of that, then you can go back and you can go fishing. Okay. You don't want to do that. You really don't want to fish while you're writing your results for your dissertation and for a study that you're going to publish or whatever, because you can do this later. And the reason that you can do it later is because oftentimes we find out things serendipitously. Okay. We may have 3 variables in our study, like I put here, A, B, and C. We're looking at the association between A and B. And we hypothesize that it's actually going to be a strong positive association or whatever. When we get it, it's not significant. But then we turn around and we get an unexpected association between A and C that we didn't expect. That can tell us a lot of things, and that can also direct us to doing another study, or it can direct us in a different direction. So we don't want to be so strict that we don't look at different relationships. We don't want to fish. But, excuse me, we want to fish correctly. We want to make sure we're not just doing it to prove something in our data. We want to follow all the guidelines that we need to follow to do the data correctly, above board, ethically, reported ethically. But it doesn't mean we don't want to try to look at those different relationships. Does anybody have any questions about that? I just wanted to touch on that because that's what came to my mind in the terms of the way I worded that last final question and had y'all doing some different things. And again, that's me. I do that fishing, and I wanted you to have some more experience in running those tests and everything. But then I also want you to understand that fishing blindly is just not really, it's not what you should be doing. You should have meaning behind it, okay? You want the right balance between the key ideas, the theory, and all of that, so you don't want to steer off course. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on that. That's one of the ethical parts of doing research. And I can promise you that it happens all the time. People do it all the time in order to be able to present the results that make them look good. You know, unfortunately, in the academic world, publications is your road to tenure. And so there's so much pressure on that, especially if you're at an R1 and you have so much pressure, that there can actually be some unethical actions taken to get publications done. So it's worth mentioning. So now let's talk a little bit. We're gonna do the ANCOVA, but we're gonna just kind of look at, when we talk about ANOVA, we have different ANOVAs we can basically run. We have the basic one-way ANOVA, we have the factorial ANOVA, we have the repeated measures ANOVA, we'll have the ANCOVA, we'll have they all have their foundation in the ANOVA, okay? So it does kind of become like an alphabet soup. Can y'all tell I was hungry when I was doing this? I was fishing and now I got soup. So for the ANOVA, again, 3 or more independent categories and 1 scaled variable. So between group participants, you have to have those categories and you have to have the 1 scaled variable. When we have the factorial ANOVA, we're looking at 2. We're looking at categories, and then we're looking at 2 or more independent variables. We have our repeated measures, which actually look at the same group. And tonight we're going to talk about the ANCOVA. All right. And again, I broke this down here for you in terms of what we've already done with the one-way ANOVA and the two-way ANOVA. So when we're talking about the ANCOVA, it's like the ANOVA, it's the analysis of covariance and has a single continuous dependent variable. So in the analysis of covariance, it compares a dependent variable by both a factor, which is like your group, so like gender, like educational level, something like that, and another continuous independent variable. So it can compare a test score by education and by number of hours spent studying. The continuous independent variable, okay, the term for the continuous independent variable used in the ANCOVA is a covariate. And what you're actually doing here is you're controlling for additional influence. So we know that test scores may be impacted by level of education, because if you give somebody a test that is at 8th grade level and they're in 5th grade, they're not going to do well on it. But we also know test scores can be impacted by the numbers of hours spent studying. So what we're trying to do with the ANCOVA is we're trying to account for both of those, or the interaction of both of those, okay? You're essentially doing a regression. It's very similar to a regression, but it handles the variables a little bit differently than when you do a regression. So you have to decide, is an ANCOVA appropriate for this data, or is regression appropriate for this data? You have to look at that and make that decision. So the one-way ANCOVA, it's an extension of the one-way ANOVA, and it incorporates that covariate, that other variable that could be, that confounding variable that could be impacting that relationship, okay? We want to use it to determine if there's any significant differences between two or more independent, unrelated groups on a dependent variable. So remember, our groups have to be unrelated. The people can only be in one of them. All right. It looks at differences in the group means, and then the ANCOVA looks for differences in adjusted means. And that means because it's adjusted for that covariate. So when the ANCOVA runs and looks at the difference for those means among those groups, it adjusts for that covariate in there, okay? So it has the benefit, if you use it, other than different from regression, it has the benefit of statistically controlling for that third variable. So the third variable can be confounding your results, and it's called the covariate. The assumptions for the ANCOVA are similar, but we have a few new ones, okay? The dependent variable and the covariate variables should be measured on a continuous scale. So the dependent variable and the covariate, if there's more than one covariate variable, those are interval ratio, okay? Your group or your factor, again, is the categorical. It's the independent variable, and it's categorical. So is salary dependent upon gender in this particular organization? Is I can't think of another one right now. The third one is for the independence of observations. There's no relationship between the observations in each group or between the groups themselves, okay? So if the study fails this assumption, you'll have to do a repeated measures design. The covariate is independent of the treatment effects, which is which basically is the covariate and the independent variable are independent of each other. And you can run an ANOVA on the covariate, and it should not be significant. Okay, so what you can do to check for this right here is, and what we have tonight is we have variables, we have salary, we have education, we have gender, and we have classification. So we will run our salary will be our dependent variable. Our group can be our gender, and our covariate could actually be years of service. But before we did that, we would want to run an ANOVA on years of service and gender to make sure it's not significant, to make sure that they are not going to make sure that it's not going to be a significant relationship. Okay. No significant outliers. That's a standard one. Residuals should approximately normally distributed for each category of the independent variable. Now, this is one of those assumptions that you can violate some because ANCOVA is very robust to this violation of normality. So it can be violated to a degree and still provide some valid results. So it doesn't have to be as exact as it is in some of the other tests. We want the needs to the homogeneity of variances, and we'll use the Levine's test for homogeneity of variances, and we want the Levine's test to be not significant when we look at it. The covariate should be linearly related to the dependent variable at each level of the independent variable. You can create a grouped scatter plot of the covariate in this, and I'll show you how to do that. I think I remember how to do that in SPSS. I'll show you how to do that so that you can look for a linearity related to the dependent variable at each level of the independent variable. There needs to be homoscedasticity, and again, test by plotting of the scatter plot of the standardized residuals. And there needs to be homogeneity of regression slopes, which means that there is no interaction between the covariate and the independent variable. So that's a new one also too. So I did send out the data that we'll use tonight. It's got salary, gender, education, and classification. Okay. So any questions about any of that information yet? Okay. So let me pull up the data. Oh, why is it over here? There we go. Can you see it now? Okay. I'll trust if you can't, you'll tell me. So this will be the data that we'll be using to run an ANCOVA. All right. And one of the ways, again, we're going to look at salary as it relates to gender. And what did I do it on? And education. We'll do it as salary relates to gender and education. And the interaction with gender and education. Education is in years. Gender is 1 is male, 2 is females, and then our salary is it's the annual salary in dollars. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at for this particular example. So I'm going to. I cannot find. For some reason, I don't have all of my toolbars that I can see. This down. Okay, there we go. Now I've got my toolbars up there. Okay. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to actually look for independence, or we want to make sure that there's no relationship between our covariate, and our covariate is going to be education and our gender. I think that's right. So we'll start off by just running a plain ANOVA for that, which is compare the means. And a one-way ANOVA. And so we're going to put education, and we're going to put gender. We're going to do our post hoc, and just for fun, for mignon, we're going to do the bon ferroni. Will be French tonight. I think that's French, isn't it? Okay. So we wanted it to be not significant, and it's not significant. So that's one of the assumptions that we've met and we don't have to worry about. Okay. Oh, let me do the new share. There we go. Yeah. So you can see right here, the ANOVA is not significant. Let me go back to the ANCOVA.
Dr. Judd,
Yes.
quick question. So you know how we did a ANCOVA multivariate, the one from the previous
We did a
assignment,
repeated measures.
repeated measures. Is that something like this, what you just did?
Now, are you talking about the homework assignment? for
Yes.
Number 4?
Yes. Well,
It
no,
is.
not number, yes, number 4, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, it's going to be very similar. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm going to record it separately. I'm not going to go over it tonight, but I'll record it separately and put it up for you. Because it's going to be very similar.
Okay.
So we're going to, when we run our ANCOVA, we're going to do analyze. We're going to do general linear model. We're going to do univariate. So it's our general linear model, our univariate. Our salary is going to be our dependent variable. Okay. Our fixed factor is going to be our gender. And we're going to say our covariate is going to be, do I want education or years of service? Come from my output. Okay, we're going to say education. So our covariate is going to be education, okay? Now, we're going to go into our EM means, and we're going to put move gender over there, and we're going to say compare main effects. So you've got display means for gender and compare main effects. And then looky here, this is where we're going to change. We're going to choose the bon ferroni. And we're going to say continue. Okay. We're going to choose model. And under model, we're going to choose build terms. Okay. We've got, when we click on the arrow in the middle, we have interaction. And then, so for interaction, we want to take gender and education. So when you click on gender, click on shift and then move your arrow down and it'll pick up both of them. And you've got gender times, you've got education times gender as your interaction. And then we're going to come down here, we're going to say main effects, and we're going to move each one over. So your model should look like education with gender, gender and education. We're going to say continue. Okay. We're going to do our descriptive statistics in our options. We'll do our homogeneity test. Go ahead and do our residual plots. Click your residual plots. Click continue. I think that has everything on there. And so we'll hit OK. So you should now, I did a new screen, so you should now be able to see my univariate analysis of variance. Can you see that at the top? Is that what you're seeing up there? So we have male and female, which is our between subjects. That's our factor, basically, male and female, that's our group. We have our descriptive statistics right here. So it shows for male, we have an annual salary mean of 36,833. And for female, 32,500. Okay. We have our Levine's test of equality, error of variances. It is not significant, and that's what we want. So we met that assumption. It is not significant. And then when we scroll down, whoops, we have our test of between subjects effects. And see, here's our F and here's our significance. And so this tells us where our significance is, if there's going to be any. So we look at the interaction between gender and education, and it's not significant. We look at just gender and salary, our relationship between gender and salary. It is significant. Okay. Education and salary is not significant. So this right here is your post hoc. This breaks it down so that you have that information right there. Okay. When you look at your estimates right here, look at how your mean has changed. Your mean for males now is 30,672, and your mean for females is 39,950. See how that annual income has changed, the mean estimates there? That's because this takes into account the covariance of education. So your estimates take into account how your covariance impacts your mean. Okay. So right here, we actually have, this is our multiple scatter plotting that we can look at, and we can look at salary with gender education. So there's a different way to run this and it's easier to tell, but basically when you look at all of our relationships here, we don't have any linear relationships. They're all over the place, right? So we don't have any linear relationships. There's another way I'll show you to do that in there so that you can do it by building your graphs, and then you can put what you need to in there, and then you'll be able to look at that. You're going to get basically the same thing. And I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. So that really right there is the sum of your ANCOVA. And what it tells you is you do not have a significant interaction with gender and education, but you do have a significant interaction with gender and salary. So
I got a quick question on
okay.
the buildup of this for the analysis. Okay, so you did main effects, which is just going to tell you like differences between salaries according to gender, right? Gender being the fixed factor, like as if you would do a regular ANOVA.
Yes.
And then the interactions of gender and education together.
Yes.
And then the influence of the covariant, right? Those are like three different
yes
of information. Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So not including all the write-ups about assumptions and all of that kind of stuff, just for the ANOVA write-up. Let me find it here. For this, just for the ANCOVA, just for this part of it. Again, I know that you've seen from the other things, you do your descriptives and you provide your means and all that kind of stuff. But just for this part, you would say something similar to a one-way between subjects ANCOVA was calculated to examine the effect of gender on salary, co-varying out the effect of education. Education was significantly related to salary. Okay. And then we have our F, our degrees of freedom, and our P factor for that one off of that estimates table. And then we have the main effect for gender was not significant. So with males not having a significantly higher salary than females, and we pulled that from the very first one, from the first mean, not the covariant mean, the very first mean, even after covariant for years of education. So basically in our data right there, what it says is that gender is not related to their salary, even it's not significant, even when we include their years of education. But years of education was significantly related to the salary.
And that statement, education was significantly related to the salary, that's saying some of the variance in salary can be attributed to years of education, right? Is that what that means when it says
Yes,
related?
essentially that's what that means. Yes.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah. So really running it, it's not a lot, I mean, it's not a lot different than let me bring this back up. It's not a lot different than when you run other things. All of the other stuff that you do in terms of your descriptives and describing your sample and your assumptions and all of that follow the same patterns as what we've already done when we did multiple regression, when we did repeated measures ANOVA, when we did those. And then it just runs a little bit differently here. The output gets a little more simple to read. You don't have to read quite as many tables when you get some of this output to break that down. So questions on the ANCOVA? I mean, that really is it in a nutshell.
I had a quick question, I think, on the assumptions, if I can find my page that I wrote
Okay.
that question down on.
Mhm.
Okay, yes. The independence of observations, that was that like matrixy type graph that showed like random plots, right?
That's linearity. Independence of observations, really for this, it goes back to me. I'm going to pull it up here. We ran the ANOVA on the covariate. Remember, we ran the ANOVA in terms of the covariate being education and gender. And it was not significant. So our covariate and our independent variable were independent of each other.
Okay, so you just do an ANOVA with your fixed factors, in this case would be gender, and the covariate, which is education.
Yeah.
And if there's no differences between groups.
If it's not significant, yeah, then they're,
Okay.
yes, then you're okay. Mhm. Now I'm going to do a new screen. Okay. I'm going to see if I can remember how to do this with the graphs and to do the multiple scatter plots so you can look at all of those. If you go to graphs, you go to legacy dialogues, you go to scatter, okay? And then here you have a matrix scatter. So you can click on the matrix scatter and you can define. Well, let me try something else here. Let's go to graphs, legacy, scatter, simple scatter. No, it is the matrix ones. Okay, I remember now. It's been a little while since I've done this one, and I didn't do it tonight, before, and I should have. Okay, the matrix one. Let me go to options. Okay, so we're going to include set by markers is our gender. We're going to do our salary and our education. Let's see what that gives us. Okay, so that gets us, get a new share here. So that gets us this right here at the bottom. And when you double click on it, you're going to be able to bring this up. And right here, it says add fit line to subgroups right there. It's that middle one right there. So I'm going to add the fit line to the subgroups. So right here, I've got education and salary. And again, salary and education right here. Male being the light blue, female being a little bit darker. But you can see that where these linear lines come in, I don't have, they're not linear associated here. So that would be one that with this data set, we did not meet that assumption right
We
there.
can't see the pop-up box that you put that in, but if you click off of it, I think it'll show us the lines back on the original box.
Okay.
Because we can't see that part.
Now, can you see? Okay. Can you see that part? Okay. Thank you, Brandy. Yes. But so you can see our cases are all over here. They're not really by those lines right there. But that's a way to do when you do a graph so that you can look at the multiple relationships, the multiple scatter plots that way.
So this is where I get confused because it looks linear to me, like visually. Does this have something to run so there's no statistics that can
No, it's pretty much going to be visual, but if you look, it's really not. So see this light blue line here for education and salary? See the light blue line where my arrow's going up and down? Can you see that, Brandy?
Yes.
Okay. Right around it is the light blue, which are the males. And so you can see, now you have a direction here, but these need to be closer to the line.
Okay.
They need to be closer to the line right here. They're kind of scattered everywhere. And if you see up here, you see they're kind of scattered everywhere. So they need to be closer to that line for it to really be linear. Now,
Okay, I think I was just looking at the direction of the line and not the tightness of the fit around it.
Yeah, more the tightness of the fit around is what we're looking at here. So really what it's telling us is we have a positive, I guess it'd be a positive. Because salary goes up as years of education goes up. So we have a positive relationship, but it's not a strong relationship because it's not here. Okay. It's kind of all over the place. And we saw that when we ran our ANCOVA because we didn't get that type of significance when we looked at gender and education with salary. So education was not statistically related to salary where gender was. And you can kind of see that we don't have that relationship right there.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Other questions? Is it beginning to make more sense as you see some of the similar things happening, or is it still kind of all mushed up?
Mushed up. Well, it's making it's making a little sense, but I think I had more issues with trying to find the specific type of data set to even get. If it was I think the previous assignment that we had, it was a multivariate ANOVA. And so I kind of struggled on that one. And so it's just actually kind of knowing what to plug in, where to put it, and how to get the outcome of everything and actually how to run the data set. And so, but for the most part, it makes a little sense.
Okay. And again, I'm gonna tape the ANOVA, and I'll have that for you. And when I look at your homework, sometimes it's hard to find data sets to plug in. When you draft your own study and you know your variables and you know what you're looking for, the data always makes so much more sense to you than when you're using somebody else's data, or you're trying to find data that will, so you can practice run something. So that does make it a little bit more difficult. I actually ran 3 different data sets, and that just haphazardly I had, and couldn't come up with a significant one for this tonight on that part. But yeah, it's what you're going to find is each test kind of follows the same patterns. You're kind of looking at the same thing. All the ANOVAs, no matter what it is, you're looking at that F score and you're looking at that significance level. You know, your assumptions, those are all basically the same thing. Some tests can violate, you can violate some of the assumptions with some tests, but if you learn the assumptions and just look at them for every test you do, then you're going to learn which one of those you need, that can violate and can't violate. It's just repetition. It really is just repetition. So no matter what test you're running, look at those descriptives. Do you have the outliers? Is there relationships between your independent variables when there's not supposed to be? Is your dependent variable and your independent variable correlated? Because they need to be. So as you learn those assumptions, you'll be able to apply those no matter what test you're running. And then you're going to be able to learn, well, I'm going to choose this test for this reason, and I'm going to choose this test for this reason. I wish it was really concrete, like when we learned our multiplication tables, you know, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4. I wish it was that concrete, but really, it's really not that concrete. Statistics has got a lot of variances in it in terms of what test you choose to run. I mean, it's defined, of course, by your level of variable, and it's defined, it's going to really be influenced in terms by your research question and your hypothesis. But as you can see, you can do, depending on what you're looking for, you can do a multiple regression, or you can do an ANCOVA. I mean, because the multiple regression would be looking at how much variance education and years of service and gender may have on salary. But when you do multiple regression with that, you know, gender, it's a dichotomous variable for this particular one, male and female, so it will work. But if you had classification in there and you used clerical, professional, technical, you're going to have to dummy code those when you're doing multiple regression, where in the ANCOVA, you don't have to dummy code those because it'll handle the 3 categories. So those are the minute details that you learn as you go, so that you'll know which one's going to be the best option or the better option to run. And ideally, as you define your study and your variables and your questions, you're going to know what you need to run before you ever gather your data. Again, that's in the hypothetical real world scenario, just like you always check your assumptions before you run things. You're going to know what you run ahead of time based on the level of your variable and then the relationships you're looking at. But beyond that, everything kind of falls into similar patterns in terms of how you're running it in SPSS and the things that you can do with it. When you go over into your data section, there's a lot of things you can do in the data section to transpose your data. If I can bring that back up. And I think I showed you some of this on your homework, like you can do your select cases and you can choose what you want to, if you want to eliminate things, you can right here, you can recode your variables. They're somewhere in here. Supposed to find multiple response sets. you can define multiple response sets in terms of when you have ordinal level data. A lot of times define variable properties, sort variables right there. There's one for recoding and I can't find it. Oh, transform. It's under transform. When you go under transform, you can actually recode into same variables or recode into different variables. And sometimes you do this. This is one thing I did with the data I was working on this weekend. I used the Likert scale, and my Likert scale said from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And I had 5 levels in there. And what I found is I didn't have a lot of variance between strongly agree and agree, or strongly disagree and disagree. I collapsed that into agree and disagree. So then I have a dichotomous variable for the statistic I need to run. And so I recoded that into different variables using this. So there's a lot of things. SPSS is really powerful. There's so many things you can use in here to run your data, but it's just a matter of just playing with it and learning it. I mean, just playing with it to see what works. Any other questions related to ANCOVA? None?
I'm sorry for asking so many questions, but
Please ask.
sometimes I gotta interpret in my own head, like so that I
No
have it
problem.
later on. So like it's basically like doing an ANOVA, which is a comparison of 2 or more groups on a dependent variable, but then it includes also the multiple regression all in one, right?
Essentially, yes, essentially it does. Because it's the ANOVA, you have 2 or more groups. Ideally, you have 3 groups, because really, if you just have the 2 groups, you can do the independent samples. So you have the ANOVA, it's looking at 2 groups, 2 or more groups on a dependent variable, and that dependent variable is interval ratio. Okay, so you have your categories. Some people call them factors, some call them categories, whatever. So you have your groups, then you have that. And then you're bringing in another independent variable that may be influencing that relationship. So that's very similar, because when we do multiple regression, we actually look at the different independent variables and how much they're contributing to the variance, the overall variance in that dependent variable. So it's kind of the same, a little bit different in some ways, but it's, yes, you're looking essentially at the same things.
Gotcha. Okay, because I remember on multiple regression, the output did include like the covariance analysis, which sounded similar to what we're doing today. So, okay.
Yes. Yeah. And basically what you're doing with these multiple, the repeated measures ANOVA, factorial ANOVA, the multiple regression is you're getting more complicated. So you're not just looking at the influence of one independent variable on a dependent variable. You're looking at the influence of multiple independent variables on a dependent variable.
Okay.
And you have different tests to do that with.
Gotcha. And when you go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, because the things that we look at, human behavior is complicated. It cannot be explained by one independent variable. Okay, so it can't be explained by salary in an organization, really can't be explained just by gender. You've got to look at those other co-varying variables that may be impacting that to get the true picture of that. So that's what we're trying to do with these more complex relationships instead of just straight linear, one-to-one.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And when you were pulling it up and we were selecting our stuff for the output, you did general linear model univariate. Is that
Yes.
because it's one dependent variable? Is that what makes it univariate? Okay. If I don't know why something is, I can't let it go. So I'm sorry.
You know what? We are on the same page. It's got to make sense in my head. And I was, Miley Green, she can't meet in our class. She works. And so her and I've been meeting some on the weekends. And I explained to her yesterday, every single time you go in to do some statistical analysis, if you haven't done it for a while, it's going to be going over again in your head. So it's not like the math that we use every day that just becomes second nature to us. It's something that you're going to have the basics to it, but every time you go in to do it, unless you truly are a data scientist or a statistician and you do it every single day, you're going to struggle getting back up to speed. But each time it's going to be easier, because the more you do it, the more repetition you have, the better you get at it. And so it's like me, it has to make sense in my head for it to make sense when I run it. So it does. I'm not fast with it. I'm not fast with it at all. I guess I fish some, but it really has to make sense to me. So I do extra steps and take extra time with it. And that's just, I've always done it that way. And as many times as I've done it, I still do it that way. I'm not fast with it. Some people could be, but I'm not. So don't think you're supposed to be. You're not supposed to be Lightning McQueen or anything like that. Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? That's all I got tonight. I'm done. I'm over, just like y'all are. And we only
Thank
have a few
you.
more weeks and we're going to get it finished up. And you guys are going to move forward and do amazing.